So thank you for coming to our session today. My name's Shirley Hall, I'm the Head of Innovation and Wellbeing, and my colleague Michael Spellman is going to talk in more detail and talk about a case study. But we really wanted to talk to you today about us, about the ExtraCare Charitable Trust. We are a charity that has retirement villages. Did anybody see Old People's Home for 4-year-olds? Yeah. Great, so some of you know a little bit about us then. That was at one of our largest villages, which is Larkhill Village in Nottingham. So that it gives you a flavour of what our residents are living in, so you know, big, large-scale villages. So we're going to talk to you a little bit about us, about our model, about the impact of our model, and then I wanted to talk to you a little bit about our research findings, in particular in relation to mental health and memory. And then Michael's going to talk about our dementia programme and finishing with a case study. So we've been a registered charity since 1988, and our vision is literally just that. You know, we want to have better lives for older people. It's run by trustees, and we do have surpluses, but our surpluses are reinvested in the charity. So our surpluses enable us to provide the wellbeing service, provide the dementia support programme, and actually provide a lot of the funding for care because of the shortfalls in care. So we're finding now that we're putting over £2 million into care services, and we're enabled to do that by the surpluses. We get some funding from our residents because our residents pay their charges, community charges, service charges, amenity fees. A little bit from government, although that has changed radically. I've been there 6 years, and when I started we had quite big block contracts. That's all gone, as you know. So it is very much paying for the care as it's delivered. And then we rely on charitable donations. We do have some charity shops. We have just over 50. But again, it's a very difficult market. I was talking to somebody earlier about fundraising, donations, shops, and there's just so many people competing in a very difficult market. And we do have funding from Lloyds Bank that enables us to build the villages. So this is what it looks like. You know, this is one of our big villages in Coventry, in Earlsdon Park. That was opened 2-3 years ago now. 2016. So this is one of our larger villages because it goes up to 9 floors, and that was a smaller footprint. We work very closely with the local authority who will identify some land, hopefully either free or cheap land, that enables us to build. But of course we also have to look at where that village is going to be, because residents might want to, you know, go into town, or, you know, easy access, is it on a bus route? They're all the sort of things we need to consider. And our model's changed and constantly being updated. So if you go into one of our villages, like Lovat Fields in Milton Keynes, that was built 11-12 years ago, that looks very different to Earlsdon and to Longbridge and some of our newer villages. But people do walk into the village and say, God, this is amazing. This is nothing like I expected. When I had my interview at Panelcroft Village in Newtown in Birmingham, I thought I was going to a party. It was just street music, there was Caribbean, food, music, residents having fun, and it was nothing like I expected. So if there is an ExtraCare village near you, or any of the other retirement villages, I do think it's worth a look to see that there are different models. When I go to any conferences, we tend to talk about older people at home in hospital or care homes. I think people forget there is something else in the middle. There is ExtraCare villages, there's McCarthy and Stone, lots of other providers, and sheltered housing, smaller ExtraCare schemes. And so it is about providing lots of choice for older people so that they can look and try and consider what there is available. This is our model. Our mission is to create sustainable communities that provide homes older people want. It's about the lifestyles as well that they can enjoy. So providing lots of different activities, lots of opportunities, lots of things that people perhaps wouldn't have done before. And I meet residents in our newer villages when I'm supporting wellbeing advisors doing the wellbeing assessments. And a lady said to me recently, she was moving into our Stoke Gifford village in Bristol. She was only 58, but had really poor health, had a really hard life, to be honest, and had lots of substance abuse, alcohol abuse, and so on. She said, I'm 58, I've had 6 kids, I've not worked, I've been a mum. She said, I need a sense of purpose. Kids have all left home, grandchildren all doing their own thing, and I need something. And when I told her about volunteering opportunities and what she could do in the village, she had no idea, and she said, that's going to make me feel like I'm doing something valuable again. I want to give something back. And then we do have care on site as it's needed. So when the majority of residents move in, they won't be receiving any care, but a lot of them are reassured to know there is care there when they need it. And we will often say to residents who are struggling, Actually, if you have a little bit of care, it might be half an hour a day, it might be some prompts, it might be somebody coming to check that you have eaten. That can often delay the need, for lots of care or crisis. That's what we're trying to do, because some of our residents can still have falls, still end up in hospital, and we want to prevent those crises. So that really is what we're trying to look at, our integrated model. Some very inspirational communities. The one on the top left there is Panelcroft in Newtown, which is 80% Afro-Caribbean, and it really is a great, fun environment. It really is sometimes just like a street party. But it's a mixed tenure, so we will have residents who buy their apartments outright for up to 350, 400,000, so really expensive. And then we'll have some who part own, part rent, and then about 20% in every village that are social housing. So we work very closely with the local authority who try and make sure that they will bring people in who perhaps need care, need more support, or who are coming from a 3-bedroom home that they're releasing for families, that they can bring people into a 1-bed apartment. It's for 55 plus. And we do, some people that are interested, we say if you really are interested, get your name down, because we do have big waiting lists. But we're really trying to get a balanced village profile, so that it's people in their 50s, 60s, 70s and so on, couples, single people, so that it does reflect what's going on in the local community. We really try and get residents from the local community to come inside as well, to make it a more balanced community. So other people coming in to volunteer. We talked a little bit about intergenerational this morning at different sessions, and again we want to do the same thing. Because although we did Old People's Home for 4-year-olds, which was young children, the nurseries, it's not all about young children. It's about teenagers. Volunteering is about people in their 20s, 30s, really making our older people feel like they're part of that vibrant community. So it's very outward facing. And Longbridge Village in Birmingham has entrances both sides that you come in, you can use the cafe, you can come straight into the gym, to the hairdressers, because that's what we really want for people. And older people can become a friend of the village. They can pay £1 a week and use the facilities, come and have coffee, come and meet other people and join in the different activities. And as I say, that very much the intergenerational focus. And that's also led by our older people as well. So we have people that are really experienced. They might have been nursery nurses, GPs, and they'll come and say, I've got all these skills, I don't want to stop doing, I might have stopped working, but I need to carry on doing that. So the nursery that's set up at Longbridge was set up by a lady who was a nursery nurse who said, I know what to do, I know all about safeguarding, the DBS, getting volunteers involved and parents. And she was talking to us recently and saying that it's not just the residents that have benefited from, volunteering and having that sense of purpose. But she said, we've got a lot of young mums who've come in, because it's only £1, they couldn't access those sort of cheap childcare, stay and play activities. They've created new friendships, and they've stayed and come to the cafe and spoken to our other residents. So we've got some really successful programmes going on. As I said, there's care that's there if it's needed, and we are regulated by CQC, and all of our care is good or outstanding, which is absolutely what we're aiming for. But there is a care team on site 24 hours a day, so that if somebody does pull the emergency pull cord, then there is somebody there who can respond. But sometimes when we get people moving from the community or care homes, we have to explain it's not like a care home where you can just keep pulling the cord if you want the toilet or drink or whatever. It still is very much, the care calls are delivered according to what they pay for or what the local authority commission us for. We have a wellbeing service on site, so we have a registered nurse, a wellbeing advisor, and I oversee that service. And they do a really comprehensive assessment before everybody moves in, so that we know their previous history, we look at their mobility, their personal care needs. We actually have developed our own frailty calculator as well with Aston University. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the research, but that is so that we can identify if a resident is frail, pre-frail or resilient. But of course we don't say that to the resident, we'll say this shows you're not as resilient as you could be, and these are some of the things that we think you could do. So we'll talk to them, we'll do the blood pressure, the usual clinical observations, we'll talk to them about any goals that they've got, and it might be relating to volunteering, it might be relating to a health change, it might be quite often they're worried about memory. So what can, I'm really worried about developing dementia, so what can I do here that will keep my mind stimulated? And that's where we will refer them either to our dementia programme if it's appropriate and necessary, or to the different activities that are going on. So things like the book clubs, the needlecraft, painting. There's all sorts of things that are going on. It's not all about bingo, I will say. There are just so many different things that they can do. Michael's going to talk a little bit more about the dementia programme. And we're also just getting accredited for the Gold Standards Framework End of Life, because again, our residents still, we did some focus groups, and they said, although they'd bought the home for life, they thought that at the end of life, they would probably have to go into hospital, a care home or a hospice. And we're saying, treat this as, you know, a block of flats, your own home, and if you want to die at home, you should be able to do that. So we're making sure all our staff are trained, we're making sure we've got the right facilities. We do talk about advanced care plan when they come in, even if they're 55. Have you thought about what you would want at end of life? And you wouldn't believe the conversations that it sparks between couples who say, you know what I want, and I don't know what you want. Tell me what you want. And so I say, then you need to write it down. So we will give them that documentation or refer them to somebody who can give it them. And then we've also got a project with Cruise, which is the bereavement supporter. You may have seen our table upstairs. We've got some booklets on that. And that is getting our residents to become the bereavement supporters. So they've gone through training with Cruise, with the project manager and with Michael, and so that they can talk to other residents who are bereaved. Because our wellbeing advisors and our dementia support workers were saying, you know, a lot of people are either bereaved because they've had a death, or bereaved by dementia, or bereaved because that person's changed, or that loss of identity, so they're able to support each other much more effectively. So a little bit about our research then. I think most of you will have had a little leaflet in your packs that talk about this. We launched this in March, and this was our second wave of research that we did with Aston University. We commissioned Aston University and then Lancaster University, because we had lots of anecdotal evidence, lots of residents saying this has changed our life, this is fantastic. You know, we hear those stories all the time, but the NHS and social care local authority want the hard evidence. So what is the difference if we promote this, or we build a village, or we support residents coming in? What is the effect? So we've got lots of good evidence, but I just wanted to focus on the things that related to mental health or dementia. So our latest findings, so we did a baseline assessment on over 160 residents over 6 years, followed them up at 3 months, 12 months, 18 months, and then 2 years, 3 years, and so on. Because the initial trajectory showed that our residents were kind of doing this. They were becoming more resilient, less frail, they were more mobile, they were more active, they were volunteering. Fantastic, but we needed to know if that continued. And although that trajectory does even out a little bit, versus the control group in the community, their health went down much quicker because they were on their own, they were not doing all these activities, they weren't having the wellbeing assessments and that follow-up that we were giving them. So what we did find is that, as it says there, 24% improvement in memory amongst our residents. That's great news to our residents. You know, they look at that and say, great, you know, if I move in here, I'm more likely to be able to see that benefit. We made sure that we refer residents to our locksmith, our dementia support worker, where it's appropriate. So what we were finding before is our wellbeing advisor, the gym instructor, our staff would send a referral, it would just say dementia. What does that mean? You know, you've referred somebody because they've got dementia, but what do you want us to do? So we're now making sure it says something like, this person has moved in, they're finding it hard to get down to the village, they're struggling with signs, you know, they're living on the far side, and we need to work with them on an individual basis to enable them to stay independent. So our referrals internally are much better. And now we can, because of the new wellbeing assessment and the frailty calculator, do much more specific referrals to activities, groups and volunteering. We also found a 23% decrease in anxiety symptoms amongst our residents. Now, anxiety levels tend to be fairly low anyway, but it does prompt a discussion because we use the hospital anxiety depression scale. We'll do that on an app, and then we'll show them at the end and say to a resident, this shows that you're really anxious. And they'll say, yeah, actually, it's because I'm leaving my home that I've been in 40 years, I'm leaving everything behind. I don't know whether I'm doing the right thing. Quite often we hear, my family want me to do this. You know, I'm doing it for my sons and daughters. They know that I'm becoming a little bit less resilient and not as able to be on my own. So it opens a discussion. What are you going to do to help yourself before you move in? Or if they've moved in, what can we do to support you? What activities do you think would be useful? So those conversations are really helpful. And then again, in terms of loneliness, we found 86.5% of our residents are never or hardly ever lonely because there is so much going on. which is fantastic, but also that means that there are, 13.5% who are lonely. And I think if you saw the programme Old People's Homes for 4-year-olds, there was Ken, who was living in a bungalow, his wife died, who said, I'm really lonely. You know, didn't know some of his neighbours, hadn't made some of those friendships and networks. So that was a real learning curve for us. So on the back of that, we use 4 questions from the loneliness scale, from the UCLA loneliness scale. And again, prompts a discussion. When you say to a resident, I'm going to ask you some questions about your social networks and loneliness, they straight away say, yeah, I'm really lonely. I really want to make friends, or I struggle to make friends. So we'll talk about ways to combat that. And we now have befrienders in our locations, again, you know, using our residents and having those mentors who can phone them in the first week. Because we were finding that in some of our villages, they were really well established. So Hagley Road Village in Birmingham, somebody comes down and they go to the front of the queue to the meat and veg man, and somebody says, well, you can't do that. There's a queue here, but it's a queue that we know about, but new residents don't. And they all sit in the right chairs, and it's really daunting. It's really daunting to break into that new community. So that's where the befrienders come in, take them down, introduce them to sessions, show them where they can sit, you know, how and who they can talk to. So that's been really helpful. And as I say, with the frailty calculator that we developed, we'd found in the first wave of research that 19% of our residents who were pre-frail when they moved in, they might have been living on their own, you know, doing very little, quite isolated. We're then changing that environment for them, giving them the opportunities, and 19% moved from pre-frail to resilient. So again, you know, we know that frailty is a predictor of care needs. So if we can delay that onset and we can give them some coping mechanisms, it hopefully means that they're more enabled to stay independent. Right, I'll hand over to Michael.
Okay, thanks very much. So, as Shirley said, I'm going to talk you through our what we call our Enriched Opportunities programme, which is our dementia support service, basically. But a little bit of information about dementia and mental health and ExtraCare. At the moment, kind of as of last month, probably from about 4,500 residents, about 403 of them are known to be living with dementia. And 586 when we combine the people that we know of with symptoms of dementia and people have actually got a diagnosis, because as we know, it's not a guarantee that someone living with dementia would actually go on to get a diagnosis, and that's something that we really try and promote and make sure that people get a diagnosis if they want one, and also get the benefits of having one. And about 490 residents with a whole mix of other mental health needs as well. So they can be very common conditions like depression and anxiety, which again often go hand in hand with dementia, but also people with probably more rarer things like, you know, schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and of course we can support people with those needs to a certain degree, but it's very important that we understand that there are those residents with those needs living in our retirement villages. I mean, mental health for over 65, so 1 in 4, something like that, it's always going to be part of what we have to think about in addition to dementia. So the Enriched Opportunities programme was really about both things. Building a retirement village, I think we first built a retirement village in 1998 in Stoke-on-Trent, and one of the worries was it's going to have a bit of a revolving door on the front, in the sense that some people who move in with dementia and maybe mental health issues, they're going to move into this very, very independent environment, but they could then very quickly move out. And the idea wasn't to have someone sell their house they'd lived in for 40, 50 years, live with us for 6 months, and then very quickly move into a care home. That would be an absolute disaster. And what can we actually do differently to keep hold of people who are living with dementia and just understand their needs a lot more? So between 2007 to 2009, we actually completed a randomised control trial with Bradford University, the professor called Dawn Brooker. You've probably heard of Dawn Brooker. She does an awful lot of work around dementia. She's now based at the Association for Dementia Studies in Worcester. And what Dawn basically did was, they created the role of the locksmith, a specialist role, someone who really understood dementia, in particular the Tom Kitwood enriched model of dementia, which we'll look at in a moment. They gave 5 of our locations a locksmith, one of these really well-trained individuals, and gave another 5 locations basically an extra pair of hands, and looked at over 18 months, what do we need? Do we need someone who's really specialist and understands this very complex condition, or actually is having more activities, is having an extra pair of hands on the floor going to make a difference? And obviously having the specialist made quite a big difference. The role locksmith, it was a bit of a strange name. But at the time when we did the focus group for that piece of research, I mean, 10 years ago, 12 years ago, when we think about 2007 when the research started, the word dementia wasn't used an awful lot with residents. And actually, it's only now 10 years down the line that we're exploring things like the job title, because people are a lot more comfortable talking about dementia and talking about mental health. Whereas at the time, if we'd have had dementia support worker, the chances are not many residents would have elected to actually worked with that particular member of staff, regardless of what the benefits would have actually been. But the benefits of actually having a locksmith, these were some of the headlines from that piece of research. The big one being, the residents who did work with a locksmith were half as likely to have to relocate from the retirement village setting to a residential or nursing home. The locksmith were finding lots of different ways of, well, how can we understand this person's needs better? In a building like ours, where it's not a locked environment and you've got a huge expanse of building with lots of different exits, when someone starts walking with purpose and those kinds of behaviours, those are the kind of behaviours that can very, very quickly get someone relocated into a less independent setting, regardless of actually if they're generally doing quite well. And actually, if you try and find the reason why the person's walking with purpose and try and actually meet the unmet need, chances are that person doesn't need to relocate. But in order to do that, you do need that one person really paying quite close attention and then bringing the other staff along with them. So locksmiths have to do a lot of influencing and a lot of helping other members of staff understand, well, hold on a second, there might be a different way of doing this. Or things like agitation and aggression, where we get lots of referrals to locksmiths for those kinds of behaviours. There's normally a reason, there's normally a behaviour, an unmet need driving that behaviour. And that's a big part of what the locksmith actually does. People spent a lot less time in hospital, sometimes really, really simple things such as many people not drinking properly. What kind of things can we put in place around the home to encourage that person to drink? Sometimes the simplest things such as putting more high fluid foods with high fluid content into the diet. Yes, the person's not going to remember to drink, but the person will eat lots of cucumber, they will eat lots of melon. What are the kind of things we can actually do to try and improve the person's well-being overall and not have the person having lots of things like UTIs and things that regularly get someone sent into hospital or regularly causing even more confusion. And the person was a lot more likely to have their mental health condition diagnosed. Things weren't necessarily being written off as old age. I don't think that happens so much now, but obviously 10 years ago that residents might have been more at risk of that, whereas now we're a bit more on top of things generally when it comes to noticing cognitive problems, even if they're very, very mild, because as Shirley said, residents can move in from the age of 55. And actually, if someone in their late 50s starts showing cognitive signs, would it necessarily get picked up that quickly and people thinking, well, maybe this is a dementia? Or quite often, people confusing things like anxiety and depression for dementia or cognitive problems, when actually, if you've moved house, I've moved house a couple of times, and it was quite challenging even for me. If you've just moved house from a place you've lived in for 50 years, and you have a real difficult adjustment period moving into a retirement village, well, yeah, that's kind of a given, really. That's quite a big change. Doesn't necessarily mean the person's got a cognitive problem, but maybe that person needs some support in other areas. And residents themselves actually rated their quality of life more positively when they were working with the locksmith. Decreased symptoms of depression and anxiety, and also greater feelings of social support and inclusion, because the locksmith's role was very much about occupation as well. So actually, what can we do to change the mainstream activities in a retirement village that the activity coordinator runs, so they're not just aimed at the most healthier residents who had really good cognition and really good physically. We actually want to have a more integrated community and not have very healthy people downstairs in the village centre and the people with quite complex physical and cognitive issues upstairs in their apartment not really getting involved in an awful lot. And really, I suppose the key to it all, you might have seen this before, is the enriched model of dementia. It has 5 parts to it. It's developed by Tom Kitwill, I think in about 1998. This model's over 20 years old now, but still works perfectly. Neurological impairment, health, 2 parts of it. Neurological impairment being the locksmith and the rest of the team. We kind of need to know what's actually going on with the person cognitively. Diagnosis can be helpful, but it's not the be-all and end-all. What practically can the person can and can't do? What's their memory like, and what kind of memory's been affected? Is it their short-term memory, their procedural memory? Do they have issues with visual-spatial issues? Do they misinterpret things? Things like mirrors and such can be quite a problem sometimes. We can see people being mistaken as having hallucinations and not actually having a hallucination, then misinterpreting what they're seeing. Understanding all those things is really, really important. From the LOCS's point of view, they can then share that with the rest of the team. Health, again, really important. Pain being the massive one. The amount of people that we see and behaviours that challenge, even though I don't really like that term, quite often it's a response that the person's in pain. You know, my favourite rule is see change, think pain. That's normally the first thing to actually check when you see any kind of behaviour change. Next part of the model, biography. Again, really, really important part. Whatever experiences that individual has had up until the point they move in with us are going to really colour their behaviour. We've had some brilliant examples of, like Shirley said earlier, we've got people who've had these amazing careers who've then moved in and wanted to use all of their skills. And we've also had people who've actually had some really, really challenging times. We've had people who've been through quite serious domestic abuse situations and lived in that situation for 20, 30 years. And then when the person moves in and doesn't integrate that well, doesn't build relationships with carers that easily, and you get to know them more and you think, well, actually, based on what's happened to you, I can fully understand why you behave the way you do. Whereas quite often a person's behaviour would be blamed on the dementia, or they don't engage because they've got dementia, or they don't join activities got dementia. It's like, well, no, actually, this person's had quite a life, and if you understand a little bit of it, you actually get to know the person rather than just, you know, purely the dementia. This model's all about, we understand how the person lives with dementia by tying these things together a bit like a jigsaw. Again, personality, what's the person's natural personality? Again, quite often, if we had residents who were quite vocal about certain things, it would be, oh, you know, they're vocal because they've got dementia. It's like, well, actually, no, the person's always just been like that, and that's fine, that's who they are. If you want to pop that person in the craft room and then they display behaviour that challenges, it's like, well, maybe they don't like craft, maybe it's not the dementia. That would be me if someone put me in the craft room. You know, there's other things that I might actually like to do that are linked into my personality. If we don't know any of those things about the residents, you're just kind of putting interventions in, you're going in blind really, and sometimes asking for trouble. But then inevitably the person with dementia might be the one who gets the blame or labelled difficult. And then finally, social psychology as well. So what's important to that person? Obviously, the built environment that we create, the villages, they're very, very beautiful places, lovely. And that's one part of social psychology, the built environment, but the social environment's really important as well. There's no point in having a really beautifully designed building if actually the kind of interactions that you have with the people who live there are really, really poor. What matters to that person, so what brings them comfort, inclusion, attachment, what's their identity, and what kind of forms of occupation are important for them. All really, really important things. The ones in blue, neurological impairment, biography and personality, they're fixed. We can't really change those. Obviously, there's no kind of disease-modifying drugs for dementia or cognitive issues, so we know the neurological impairment's just gradually going to get worse, so we can't change that, but we need to understand it better. We can't change a person's life history. We certainly can't change their personality, but we do need to know that information. However, health and social psychology, we can actually optimise those to make the person's life better. So, as Shirley's just described with the research and, you know, the work that we do around building people's physical resilience, if we can actually make sure that person's in less pain or taking the right kinds of medications, they're very physically in balance, they're not necessarily going to experience some of the problems if all of those things were out of whack. You know, if you weren't taking proper pain control, if you had several long-term conditions, which many of our residents had, and they were completely unchecked and out of control, that's going to have a massive impact on that person's behaviour and general well-being. And equally, social psychology. What are the little things that we're actually doing on a day-to-day basis that are actually driving that person up the wall, that we're then seeing as a challenge? And it could be something really simple, like a carer not knocking before entering a person's apartment. Sometimes we get into really quite small details when it comes to the social psychology. I suppose the case study, the very simple case study I've brought with me to show you, is a big part of the success of this was social psychology, really, just by building a good relationship with a community client. This actually wasn't someone in one of our retirement villages. It's a very new case study from a service we've just started in Solihull, where people living with dementia or cognitive issues get discharged from Solihull Hospital in Birmingham, back home into the community, and the locksmith, a care team and occupational therapist work with them for about 6 weeks to find out what's going on with that person's dementia, you know, how do they experience dementia, with the aim of trying to tweak things so that the person can remain living at home rather than bouncing back into hospital or moving into a less independent setting. And all of these things were really, the referral was basically poor nutrition. The person wasn't taking their medication at all. The few times the gentleman did take his medication, he overdosed on the different medication he was taking. And hoarding was a problem, but he'd never actually had a diagnosis of being a compulsive hoarder. There wasn't any kind of diagnosis of an anxiety disorder, but the house had got into an extremely cluttered state, and not just a few items laying around. This was literally, the house was full of all sorts of different things, and it had probably been going on a lot longer than his cognitive symptoms had. He'd probably had cognitive symptoms for a couple of years, whereas his hoarding behaviour must have been going on for a decade or more. So really the locksmith breaking that down, very, very simple things. Sometimes when I do case studies, we look at things like technology. That's always a popular one for these kinds of events, but I like this case study because it was really about building a relationship with a gentleman. I don't know how many people had necessarily done that, and actually just by focusing on social psychology, you can achieve an awful lot. He was simply not cooking very well because his kitchen was full of whatever he'd been buying from the shops, you know, and some of his hoarding compulsions. There was just nowhere to actually go and do any cooking in there. The locksmith noticed actually he had an awful lot of ingredients. He would buy things like food. He had an interest in food. When you actually sat down and spoke to him about food, he really quite enjoyed cooking things like curries. And it would be quite unusual to see, well, how come he's got all of these spices and things if he doesn't necessarily cook? So by clearing some space in his kitchen, actually he is quite capable of cooking quite complex meals in some cases, you know, like Indian cooking or what have you. There's a lot of different flavours in there to balance. There's a lot of different use of spices. He couldn't do his weights and measures anymore, but he was actually really quite capable of cooking with a little bit of support. So his nutrition gradually improved. Medication, okay, found it difficult to accept any help. The gentleman had been living alone for a long time. Because of how his house looked, he had a lot of insight into how his house looked to other people. And that was a big reason around refusing care and not necessarily wanting any engagement from other people. So helping him overcome that was quite gradual. The locksmith, by building a good relationship with Hannah the locksmith, she was then able to introduce the carers a bit more gradually. So, like, well, I'm going to do things with you to start off with. You know, we're going to get you a safe, you know, so you can put your medication in there. You haven't got to worry about that. The carers are then going to kind of come in and help you with that. Trying to keep consistency in carers, as we heard earlier, was really important where we could. And eventually, he was also able to have the memory clinic team come in. He'd had a couple of appointments at the hospital prior to Hannah the locksmith working with him. But because he was a little bit more trusting after building up that relationship with Hannah, he did eventually let the CPN come in, do a few more tests on him. They eventually diagnosed him with vascular dementia, and that had some practical. I think he was prescribed memantine in the end, so we did get another medication from it, which may help. And also he was at least on their radar now. And he also had some of the financial benefits of having the diagnosis as well, like his attendance allowance was increased and, you know, reduction in council tax and that kind of thing. And then hoarding as well. And even though we didn't necessarily understand how long his hoarding behaviour had been going on, must have been a long time, actually just by getting to know him a little bit and not, what he was very concerned about was people coming in and just telling him, you shouldn't be doing this, which obviously if you've been doing that behaviour for 10 years or more, someone coming in and saying you shouldn't be hoarding isn't necessarily going to fix the problem. And Hannah really kind of understood that, and I think that's why the relationship worked. That's why the social psychology part worked. One of my favourite things from his case study was, well, why buy one when it's 4 for £1? And just helping him put a shopping list together was really useful. She made him a template, printed about 100 off for him, so that when you go to the shops, here's a list of things that you need, and then here's some things that you don't need. You don't need to buy those big packs of chewing gum, you know, you got the individual pots, because there was hundreds of those scattered around the house. They were all empty. And also, one of the issues in the past people had with addressing the gentleman's tidying up his house, he wouldn't throw things away, but if you said, well, actually, we're going to recycle it, and we're going to get you a bin for your rubbish and a bin that's very obvious for recycling, he was more than happy to recycle things, but not happy to throw them away. But that was one way of gradually starting to clear out the house. So eventually, between the 19th of February this year and the 20th of March, he did manage to clear the kitchen and the living room, and there was a lot of work to do in that house. However, because he's kind of been set off on that routine now, the care company that are going to come in now after the 6 weeks and look after that gentleman, they're going to take, well, what did Hannah do? Why did he respond to it in that way? Which is basically that good use of social psychology. If we do the same thing over several years, we should be able to help him clear that house and maintain those routines. So in a fashion, that short-term intervention from Hannah was about kind of setting up some long-term goals. And so overall, it was 10 visits, about 29 hours, which in the big scheme of things isn't that much. And so there wasn't any technology used or anything like that, but purely that very, very person-centered relationship, that good use of social psychology can actually have a really good impact. Like I say, the long-term care agency have now come in, and Hannah's just doing the handover at the moment, and hopefully that's something that will continue and mean that gentleman won't eventually sell that house and move into a care home. Hopefully he'll be able to stay there for a lot longer. This gentleman's only in his mid-70s as well, so there's a good chance he might be able to stay at home. Who knows, maybe even another decade. And it's probably a win for the local authority as well, and probably maybe his local health services, who he was using a lot, when he, because of the situation he was in. So very simple case study, but very, very effective. And I'd say that's probably why even though the enriched model is about 20 years old now, and we've been using it ourselves for 10 years, even though it's something I suppose maybe a little bit old-fashioned, I don't think that kind of good old-fashioned kind of compassion and care doesn't really go out of fashion, doesn't it? It always works, regardless of what other kind of interventions we can actually put in place. And that was it from us.